Welcome to the AWIP podcast. I'm your host, Ray Smith. Here we focus on investigations and all things animal welfare related. We're bringing you in-depth conversations each week with animal welfare professionals from around the globe, so be sure to find us on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Spotify. It is National Puppy Mill Awareness Day today, so this is our surprise episode, and I'm really pumped because I was able to get a hold of our guest for today, who's the Director of Outreach and Research for the Stop Puppy Mills campaign at the Humane Society of the United States. And so I'd like to bring on Kathleen Summers. Kathleen, how are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, we appreciate it. And, at AWIP, one of the things we focus on is the puppy mill trade. And so I thought kind of the merging of AWIP and HSUS here to talk about puppy mills and all of the initiatives that we have to try and end them would be really great for today, which is Puppy Mill Awareness Day. So, Kathleen, before we dive into our content here, can you go through history of animal welfare, how you got to be where you are today?
Well, I've been with the Humane Society of the United States for 18 years. That's approximately as long as we've had our Stop Puppy Mills campaign. And prior to that, I was on the board of an animal welfare organization that did more hands-on rescues and also published newsletters for local SPCAs and also had experience working in vet clinics and boarding kennels. But when I joined the HSUS, they, as I mentioned, the Companion Animals Department had just started its Stop Puppy Mills campaign because so many people were contacting HSUS about sick puppies that they had purchased either online or from pet stores who were very, very sick. And we were hearing a lot of heartbreaking stories. And when we were reaching out to the agencies in charge of inspecting these puppy mills, we just weren't getting an adequate response.
I know that HSUS focuses on a lot of areas in animal welfare. For me personally, though, when I think of HSUS, I think of the Stop Puppy Mills campaign. And I think that is a big testament to you and the work that you've done in leading that department. I think that you guys do a really good job and that the work that you've done has really had a huge impact on public perception, public education, and even to the point of people professionally in animal welfare as well, getting this more in-depth look at puppy mills and really understanding the underbelly of it. So I think that, that's, like I said, that's a great testament to you and your team and to HSUS. One of the things that I wanted to chat about is the Horrible Hundreds report. So you guys publish this every year. It's fascinating, just the content and all the statistics that are in there about who's made that unfortunate list and is facing the wrath and exposure there of HSUS. I love it. For people who don't know what the Horrible Hundreds report is, they've never seen it, can you walk us through what was like the thought process behind creating that report and what have been some of the major effects of its release annually?
Sure. Well, we started publishing the Horrible 100 report in 2013, and it was in response to some people having the unfortunate perception that puppy mills are rare or that puppy mills are sort of an underground type of operation that once one is uncovered that we immediately shut it down, and that it's some people have the perception that it's the job of humane law enforcement or nonprofit organizations like ours to shut down puppy mills. But unfortunately, there aren't enough laws to make that always feasible. And the HSUS, for example, is not a law enforcement agency, and we can't go independently shut down animal abusers, although we do have a team that helps when we're invited in by law enforcement. But back to your point, the laws are not sufficient to regulate puppy mills, but a lot of people don't know that. And a lot of people, when they do their research on a breeder, they say, oh, well, I found out this breeder is licensed, or I found out this breeder is an American Kennel Club linked breeder. So I think I've done my research, and that shows this must be a good breeder who was inspected and is a high quality breeder. And unfortunately, that nothing could be further from the truth. So we wanted to put out this report with 100 specific problematic facilities in it to show the world basically that this is still a problem that is existing and that we need better laws to confront and better informed consumers.
And I had read something, I think last month, that when the 2024 report came out, like a month or two later, there was an update that, like, what, 15 mills had shut down since the release of just that report.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's
It's now
crazy.
it's now 17. They're
Woo!
not all from that recent report. Some were in that recent report and some were in prior reports. And so we do hear sometimes that some of the regulatory agencies will pay close attention when the report comes out, especially when we have people who have been in the report year after year, and we call them repeat offenders. And we do have some people who have been in the report even 8 or 9 times. So it's not always a quick process, but that's why this information needs to be out there. People need to know that there are very problematic facilities that are posting beautiful pictures on their website and saying that they're licensed, when in fact many of those licensed facilities have had many, many violations. But having many violations doesn't automatically mean that you're shut down. But fortunately, we can say that in recent months, at least 17 of them have apparently gone out of business.
Yeah, there's this vicious cycle of cite, inspect, repeat with the USDA and their APHIS department, who is charged and responsible with conducting these investigations, citing these offenders. I think, to your point, over time, with all of these campaigns from HSUS, other organizations, education in general, that a lot of people are aware, puppy mills are bad. Of course, I don't want to support them. And they, to the point that you made, that they look and they're like, oh, well, they're USDA licensed. What's the big deal? They're inspected, everything should be fine. They're going to be healthy. You and I, and people who work professionally in animal welfare, know that's not necessarily the case. And that kind of brings me to my next point, which is, can you kind of talk about the less commonly known problems with these puppy mills that are USDA licensed, and this kind of phenomenon that people may not be familiar with is that they oftentimes change their kennel names or their license numbers.
Right. There has been a significant problem with licensed breeders when they start to get a lot of violations on their records. They know that we're watching them, so very often they will maybe, for example, drop their USDA license, so they'll cancel it voluntarily. Now, when they cancel it voluntarily and it's not officially revoked, that means that they can get another one someday. But more often what they do is they'll get it in, for example, their wife's name or their son's name or under an LLC, to hide their history. So there are a few states that require pet stores, for example, to buy from breeders with no recent significant USDA violations. And when the breeder has dropped their prior license and gotten a brand new license under a different name, then all of a sudden their slate is wiped clean.
It's all about the money. It's what it comes down to, really, when you put the money over the welfare of the animals. This is why this is why these puppy mills persist. That's why we still have them to this day, which is crazy to think about. I don't know if it's just the breeders specifically who are responsible for kind of perpetuating the mill industry. The AKC has been historically very complicit with these mills. And you guys know quite a bit about that. What is the AKC's role or lack thereof?
Well, unfortunately, the AKC started out as a group that just wanted to promote purebred dogs, and they had dog shows and a lot of ways to recognize and celebrate purebred dogs. Unfortunately, over the last, I want to say maybe 2 decades, the AKC has become very political and very polarized. And we have been keeping records since 2008 of the humane bills that the AKC has opposed, which now numbers more than 500 bills. The
Oh,
AKC
really?
has opposed, yes, And it goes far beyond breeding bills. The AKC has opposed bills that would require breeders to be licensed and inspected. You can probably guess why. But in addition to that, they've even opposed bills. There was a bill in New York against dog debarking that the AKC opposes. There have been bills against leaving dogs in hot cars that the AKC has opposed, and even bills against bestiality that the AKC has expressed concerns about. So they've far overstepped any, basic responsibilities that they had to protect owner rights or breeder rights. And it's become sort of an all or nothing organization that opposes almost all humane measures designed to protect dogs.
Why is that? I mean, to me, that's just kind of like common sense. Of course, we don't want bestiality or dogs dying in hot cars. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense to me if they're wanting to, promote and continue these purebred lineage across, the breeds. Why would they be opposed to these animal welfare bills that just make sense to pass for these protections for animals so they're not being cruelly subjected to these things that I think we all can agree on should be passed?
Yes, well, the AKC does make a tremendous amount of money off of dog registrations. They made a strategic decision, again, more recently in their history, to say, that we want to be the biggest dog registry organization and get as many registrations as we can. And unfortunately, that meant that they almost by definition had to team up with puppy mills. And ever since that happened, there's just been a tremendous amount of very misleading opposition to very reasonable bills. In the case of the bestiality bill, it had something to do with the AKC being concerned about judges having to touch dogs in certain areas while they're judging them in the show, or certain practices with breeding that had to do with dogs, touching dogs in certain areas, which certainly that could have been addressed in the bill language itself to sort of
Yeah.
make it clear. But I mean, that's what we're dealing with AKC right now, and it's very upsetting because they, many Congress members still hear name American Kennel Club and think that those are people who are in the business of loving and protecting dogs, and they're not an animal protection group, far from it.
To be honest, years and years and years ago, I had thought the same thing that, AKC, of course, they're going to want to, make sure that all the separate breeds still exist. But trying to create healthier dogs that this is kind of really before I started getting animal welfare professionally. That's just kind of what I thought. I think that most people probably do. And I remember a story that I had read many years ago that there was an AKC judge in Washington, I believe it was, and she had been breeding Chihuahuas, I think. And it was a horrific hoarding case. There was law enforcement ended up going in and found, stacked crates in the basement all over the house, feces everywhere. Some of them were sick, some were injured. I mean, she was an AKC judge. And to me, that was kind of the first point in time where I was like, I don't know if AKC is really in this for promoting the health and welfare of dogs in general. It was a wake-up call. It was really eye-opening for me.
Right, and they also rallied behind a breeder in Pennsylvania who was convicted of animal cruelty in that state for doing her own tail docking very improperly on Schnauzer puppies. I understand that there are some bad apples in every group, and there are some good breeders in the AKC. At the Humane Society, we have a group called BARC, the Breeders Advisory and Resource Council, and those are small, responsible breeders. Many of them are associated with the AKC and registered dogs with AKC, but they breed very sparingly, very carefully. They know all of their dogs, and most of them keep the dogs in their home. So, there certainly are responsible breeders affiliated with the AKC, but there are many, many horrifically irresponsible ones. And it's very unfortunate that AKC is throwing all those breeders in the same bucket instead of saying, hey, we have some great breeders here, but let's do something about the bad ones.
Yeah. So I think that's a good point. So HSUS is not like anti-breeding, anti-breeders in general. It's, of course, wanting to weed out all of the bad breeders to make healthier dogs, give a lot of awareness about this. But it sounds to me kind of like what you're explaining is like with these hobby breeders, these smaller breeders where they're in their house, they're living, they do genetic testing on
Yes.
these animals, and they very specifically match the puppy and its personality to the family that it's going to. So that sounds on par with what you do and how HSUS sees some of these like smaller hobby breeders then.
Right, definitely smaller breeders. There are some groups out there that are starting to say, well, commercial breeding is okay as long as they give their animals the same amount of care and, spacious places to run and play and good health care. But, if you think about it, would you, if somebody was going to babysit your child, would you want to send your child to a daycare with 12 other children, or would you want to send your child to a daycare with 300 other children?
Yeah.
I mean, there's something to be said about that, having a greater caretaker ratio and having less noise and less crowding and less pooping. The smaller breeders are generally better equipped to pay better attention to their animals and give them the behavioral and psychological socialization and stimulation that they need.
One of the main things that's in the Animal Welfare Act, which is what the USDA regulates on a federal level, is there's no requirements for psychological health of these animals. And we had just done a training earlier this week, actually, for the public on the history of the AWA and the different requirements, basic requirements that are within that for breeders and such to follow. But one of the things is that's not included is the psychological well-being of these animals. What are some of the things? So because I know that HSUS has done investigations before. Can you talk a little bit about like some of the things that your operatives have seen in a psychological sense and the suffering that these dogs and puppies end up going through?
Right. Well, for example, our last several investigations were in pet stores. Now, if you walk into one of the big popular pet stores that have many puppies for sale, very often it will look very clean because, that's the impression that they want to give you, that the cages will be clean. You won't see a lot of poop in there. But we have had undercover investigators taking jobs in those pet stores and getting into those back rooms where the puppies are kept when they're sick. And in some cases, we see that up to 20% or even more than 20% of the puppies are sick at any given time, and they're hidden away in back rooms where they get very little care, very little attention. They are generally not treated by veterinarians. They often don't get sent to a vet until they're at death's door. The pet stores, if they gave professional veterinary hospitalization to every puppy that had pneumonia or bronchitis, they would wipe out their bottom line and they wouldn't make a profit on that puppy. So they're trying to treat them themselves with large bottles of medication that are not even specifically prescribed to that individual dog. And they do have vets come in when the puppies arrive at the store, because that's generally required by law that they provide a paper with the dog showing that the dog was examined by a vet. But that is just a 30-second exam where they, look very quickly at the dog and then sign a piece of paper.
And a
But
lot of times those diseases don't have enough time to actually show symptoms by then.
exactly. And they may know that, we had some parvo puppies that, that died, and they're not warning the public that maybe 20 other puppies were exposed to those two puppies who got sick. And there's an incubation period for parvo of up to 2 weeks. So that's often what we hear, is that people take the puppy home, and 2 or 3 days later, the puppy gets deathly ill. And when they're diagnosed with parvo, they take the dog back to the store, and the store says, well, he was healthy when he left. You signed a piece of paper saying that he looked good to you. So a lot of very, very upsetting situations going on with the pet stores.
It's like even once they get to, if they survive, if they make it out of the mill, it's like the horror is not finished because they're in a whole new type of hell once they get into a pet store. One of them one of the biggest ones is Petland. And I know that that has been a major focus for HSUS. So for anybody who's listening, if they don't know what Petland is, who are they, how widespread are they, and why are they such a major focus for you in your operations?
So Petland is the only national chain of puppy selling pet stores that's still operating in the US. They have probably about 100, more than 100 stores in the US right now, and they also have stores internationally. And, again, when you walk into their stores, you're going to be told all the right things. The AKC has even partnered with Petland to put AKC inspected signs all over their stores, which are not what you would think they would mean. When you see AKC inspected on a puppy's cage, you think that means that somebody went to that breeder and inspected that breeder.
Yeah.
What it really means is that the AKC sends a representative to the store generally to look at the paperwork on the puppies that are registered with AKC and make sure that the paperwork looks okay. So very misleading. They are the biggest purchaser of puppies from large commercial breeders in the country. And so that's why we put a lot of focus on Petland. Are there other pet stores that have sick puppies and that are in cahoots with puppy mills? Absolutely. But Petland is the largest one, and the one that is often lobbying against humane laws.
I think that's probably one of the biggest problems is, if you're the average person walking into a Petland and it's clean, everything's sterile, the puppies are, sometimes in groups, they look happy and they're playing. And then they've got this laminated placard that says USDA inspected. And, so people are like, oh, okay, I'm not supporting a puppy mill. They're inspected. I feel like it's just such misleading advertising where if you don't do the research, you're not going to know. Like, who has the time to do that and try and find the breeder or their license number? And then you might not even get the full story then, because like you had said, people, they change their numbers, they change their names, they put it with family or friends or neighbors or whoever. It's just such a huge problem. It almost feels like there's not enough education out there, that there's, revealing these secrets, these sneaky motives that these pet stores and those who the distributors and such, it takes so much time to work to expose them and then to educate the public. Because realistically, nobody's going to walk in there and, pull up their phone and look for an hour. When you have these adorable little puppies in front of you, you're going to say, oh, they're licensed, it's fine. So that has to be that has to probably be several of the problems that you do in your work in trying to debunk these things.
Right. And unfortunately, even if you do your homework and you find out, well, this puppy came from a breeder with no violations. To have no violations as a USDA breeder just means that you met some basic survival standards. So a breeder can have 300 dogs and keep them in cages their entire lives and give them very little personal care and attention. But as long as those dogs have vaccines and food and water and a couple of other minimal provisions of care, the USDA they'll pass their USDA inspections again and again. So, this is why we encourage people to go directly to your breeder. If obviously we want people to go to an animal shelter or a rescue group first if they can. There are so many wonderful dogs of all sizes and ages and breeds in shelters right now, more than ever actually, because shelters are very, very full since the pandemic ended. But if somebody insists and says, look, I want a 8-week-old Maltese and I didn't find one in my local shelter and I'm going to a breeder, then our advice is, make sure you meet that breeder in person. Make sure you see the mom and the dad of that puppy and see if they are healthy and happy, and if they run up to you and they're happy to see you. Some breeders will only have the mom because maybe the dad is owned by a different breeder. But at least meet the mom and see if she's happy and healthy, and is she somebody's pet? Is she somebody's pet where she is sleeping in a bed and, getting regular vet care, and then maybe the babies were raised humanely. But you really have to see for yourself, because unfortunately, especially online or people who sell through pet stores are only going to tell you what you want to hear.
What about, I think one of the really sneaky things that these breeders will do, and a lot of times just to skirt having to get a USDA license in the first place, is they'll be like, well, I'll meet you wherever you want. I'll meet you at your house. I'll meet you at the local Walmart parking lot. Is that a big red flag for people?
That's a big red flag. It usually means they don't want you to see their conditions, um, or don't want you to know where they live. And when you do that, if you have a problem with the puppy, you're going to have a hard time tracking that person down. But also, if you do go and find poor conditions, then you can report it.
Who should people be reporting this to? A lot of times they're like, oh, I don't know if animal control is going to do anything. Maybe the police. I don't know. What's your advice for if you suspect that you see neglectful conditions or an illegal mill and it hasn't been licensed? What should people do to report that?
Well, the first place to go is your local animal care and control agency, or rather the breeder's local animal care and control agency. If they're in a very rural area that doesn't have one, then the sheriff or police department. That would be if you see very concerning conditions such as animals with no shade in the summer heat, animals with no water, animals who have injuries, then you definitely want to report that ASAP to that local agency so they can check out the conditions. If what you see is a lot of animals in cages, they don't appear sick, they don't appear dirty, they have food and water, then it may very well be a puppy mill, but it may not be breaking any laws. But you can check with your local agency, or with HSUS, we can help you find out more resources to find out if it's a licensed breeder. And again, even so, I would caution people against buying from somebody that has massive numbers of puppies, or that somebody that has multiple breeds and always has puppies available. That's usually a sign that they're in it more for the sales than for the well-being of the breed.
When it comes to the different operations that HSUS does into these mills, how have these investigations helped shape our view of animal welfare in general?
Well, I think a lot of people are shocked when they see behind the curtain, behind the veil of what is really happening at some of these breeders who sell online or through pet stores, because again, we've actually had investigators watch a breeder take a puppy from a cage in a barn and put them on a chair in the corner of the barn that has a pretty little Afghan thrown over it, and take a picture of that puppy so it looks like that puppy's in a home. And that's what they put online, and then they put the puppy back in the cage in the barn. So I think people are really shocked when they see what's really behind these pretty photos on the websites. It's hard for some people to believe that people would treat dogs that way.
And I think not just the puppies, but the breeding males and females who are there. I mean, you could arguably say that the best outcome for a dog or cat in a puppy mill is that they get out and they go and they're shipped to some kind of pet store. I mean, it's not great. That's not what I'm saying. But you could argue that they're in somewhat better conditions. They're not going to be bred for the rest of their life versus the other alternative, which is they're there until they're used up. And I think we forget. I think maybe the public is focused more on the puppies than the dogs that are languishing there for years, sometimes decades, depending on the breed. I'm sure that has been, I mean, I know that has been a huge motivator for HSUS to expose that type of thing in the life where they're in this 2x2 cage for almost never ever leave.
Right. I once had the opportunity to help with some dogs who had recently been rescued from a puppy mill in Missouri. And one of the things I was doing was lining up with the breeding dogs to have them examined by the veterinarian who was on site at the rescue shelter. And I'll never forget, while I was holding one of these mama dogs, that literally her tooth fell out and hit the floor. She was only about 5 years old, and she was already losing her teeth because the breeding the dogs again and again and again depletes them of calcium, and they start to lose their teeth at a very young age. In addition, that the smell is something that it sometimes takes days to wash off of you. I mean, these dogs have been sitting in their own urine and feces sometimes for years, and it's very shocking. And the saddest thing of all is that most of the dogs that I've handled that came directly out of a puppy mill were sweet dogs. Even though they had been in a cage their whole lives and not well socialized, they still love to be held, and they're hardwired to be loving animals. They've evolved alongside of us. They don't, these breeds, Shih Tzus and such, don't exist in the wild. They've evolved to be our companions. So it's especially cruel to put them in a cage and not give them the love and attention that they deserve.
Yeah, 100%. It considering the physical neglect they go through is, sometimes equally as detrimental as the psychological. We kind of briefly talked about laws, and thankfully there is some good news in regards to the puppy mill industry, and a lot of states and like local municipalities have passed bans or restrictions on these operations. Can you talk a little bit about like the progression over time of the effect that HSUS has had on these states, these municipalities, and how that's progressed with these increase in laws to help at least improve the conditions of these facilities or just outright ban them?
Right. Well, many states have laws that require puppy mills to at least be licensed and inspected. And for simple reasons of having rural land available, many agricultural states are the main producers of puppies. And some of these states have these laws, but some of them are just not interested in passing these laws because of, for political reasons. So what the HSUS has been doing most recently is working on states that are concerned about puppy mills to at least have a law that the puppies cannot be sold in pet stores. And that's because it encourages people to either go directly to a small responsible breeder who they can meet in person, or a shelter or a rescue to get a dog. So many states have passed laws now ending the sale of puppies in pet stores, and about 275 localities have done so as well. One of the most recent states that passed a law which goes into effect at the end of this year is New York, and it has a large proportion of all the puppy selling stores in the country which are going to have to now shift to a humane model.
I think that's fantastic because it shows that there is hope. Things are improving. We're not there yet. We have a lot of work to do, but there is hope. And there's people, whether you work in the field or not, people care about these problems. And, we've seen this regardless of political party as well, is that people just don't like puppy mills. I think, Kathleen, one of the things that I know I hear the most is that, I want to get a puppy from a breeder because they're going to be more behaviorally sound, or they're not going to have any medical conditions because, X, Y, and Z. One of the arguments is that they know where they're coming from. And this we know is a humongous myth. What have been your findings to debunk that?
Well, purebred dogs in general, and believe me, I love purebred dogs. I have purebred dogs of my own, but they are prone to a lot of genetic conditions. Depending on the breed, it can be hip dysplasia, heart disease, lung disease, this type of thing. I have somebody in my family who I do love very much who went to what she thought was a responsible breeder to get a King Charles Cavalier Spaniel puppy. And although she loved that dog had a host of problems, developed heart disease at a very early age, and only lived about 11 years. Whereas I've had dogs from the shelter that have lived 15 years or more. That being said, there are responsible breeders who health test their breeding animals, and their animals are more likely to be healthy than an animal from a random, less expensive breeder who's selling on Facebook. So I definitely don't want to make it sound like there aren't ways that breeders can solve the problems, because a responsible breeder will make sure not to breed dogs who have those genetic conditions. But there's also a thing called hybrid vigor, which means that very often a mixed breed dog from the shelter is going to be every bit as healthy as a purebred dog that somebody spent $4,000 for.
And the evidence, the data shows that roughly around a quarter of dogs that are in shelters are purebred. And I'm not talking like breed specific rescues. I'm just talking your local animal control, your local animal shelter. I know for my shelter, we regularly have purebred dogs, Maltese and Doberman Pinschers, and, of course, Huskies and Rottweilers and such. But I think that's important to get out to the public is like, I know that you're looking for a Bernedoodle. Bernedoodles, Golden Doodles, they're some of the most commonly surrendered dogs. And I don't know if the public knows this as much. And so you have, someone who's going and spending, $2,400 on a Labradoodle, where you can go to your local shelter where they're literally giving them away for free because the shelters are so full, rescues are so full. We have no idea what to do with all of these animals. We can't get them adopted out fast enough, can't get enough fosters. And these perfectly great dogs are sitting there in kennels for extended periods of times in some cases. But what's really ironic to me is that they're concerned about the health of the animal and such, is in at least in most states, in most jurisdictions, those dogs and cats are required to undergo evaluation and examination from a veterinarian who is either there at the shelter as the shelter vet or an outside one they contract with. I mean, it's crazy. Like, people, a lot of people don't realize this still.
Yeah, most shelters are very good about screening the dogs and making sure they're healthy. Most of them even have funds available that, to provide a surgery for a dog if they need it. They're not in it for the money like some of the irresponsible commercial breeders are. So they're not going to try to sell you a dog that, maybe the mother has heart disease and they know darn well that dog's not going to live very long, if they know that dog has that condition, like a shelter rescue usually will tell you.
So I know that you do a lot of educational campaigns. Why are these public educational campaigns so important to ending puppy mills?
Well, it's very important for people to know where to go to get a dog. And again, shelter rescue, best place to go. We have information on our website on how to find a good breeder should you choose to go that route. Not a list of breeders, just a list of qualifications to look for as far as how well they take care of their dogs and health screening. But a lot of people still don't know what puppy mills are. And, it's easy for those of us in the animal welfare world to forget that not everybody else has dogs and cats on the brain every day. So sometimes somebody who doesn't know much about dogs is thinking about getting a dog. They may walk by the pet store on their way to buy shoes for their child, child's ballet class, and say, oh, well, what do we have here? And then the pet store is going to tell them everything that they want to hear. So it's very important that we get that messaging out before that person walks by a pet store, before that person maybe even thinks about getting a dog, to let people know to beware of puppy mills and to go to a responsible place for a pet.
And it's an election year, so I think that is on a lot of people's minds. And there are several major bills that are pending in Congress right now, have been for a while. One of them is the Puppy Protection Act, and another one is the Better Care for Animals Act. For those who don't know what they are, can you tell me what is in these bills and what is the point of their impact?
Sure. Well, both of these bills have more than 200 co-sponsors. They're very reasonable bills. None of them are going to shut down a single responsible breeder. Now, what the Puppy Protection Act would do is it would require those breeders who are licensed by the USDA to provide better standards of care. So the dogs would have to have much more space. They would have to have continual water available, twice a day feeding, and just better vet care and better protection from the weather than they now have. So that USDA license would mean more. And good breeders are already providing those good standards. So it's going to raise the floor and require all breeders to have much better standards of care. The Better Care for Animals Act would bring in the Department of Justice and allow them to help the USDA deal with bad breeders. For example, breeders and other types of dealers of animals who have repeated violations, repeatedly been found with injured animals, and so on. This would allow the Department of Justice to come in and help with penalties and help shut them down. The AKC has opposed both of these bills, even though they claim to be champions for dogs.
I mean, I think it just goes to show who's the real champion for these bills. It's you guys trying to educate people and understand the reasons why we need to have these passed for these protections. And I didn't know this. I found this actually the other day. that on your website there is a list of like senators and Congress people who you track that vote certain ways on these bills and like kind of have like a humane rating. And I just kind of thought that that was cool because I always think about that when I'm voting, and it just seems like they never talk about animal issues, right? And they're talking about all these things that are obviously very important, but nobody's standing up there and arguing on TV about ending puppy mills. Like, those are things that are really important to me. And so when I saw this, I was like, this is so cool that HSUS tracks these things. What are their voting record? I thought that was so interesting. I don't know if that's common knowledge because I like literally just found it.
Right. So that list is maintained by our sister organization, the Humane Society Legislative Fund. HSUS, we don't really endorse any specific candidates, but we ask that people check the records of anybody that they're considering voting for. And the Humane Society Legislative Fund will help people do that.
Okay, so important distinction, but that is interesting information. I just thought that was cool.
Yes. I mean, if in doubt, if you're not able to, if you're confused by the rhetoric of different candidates, just look at how they've voted in the past and what they've supported in the past, because anybody can pay lip service to caring about animals, but you can actually check their records online.
Well, Kathleen, I just want to say thank you very, very much for coming on to the podcast to help, especially with it being Puppy Mill Awareness Day. It's like I had mentioned, I know that this is very important to you, to your team, to HSUS. It's very important to us at AWIP. It's a big focus of ours as well. So I think that this is really cool, and I really appreciate you coming on and talking with me. There are things that I learned just now from talking to you. I've been doing this a while, so I think we all have things that we can learn from one another when it comes to all things animal welfare related, but in the mill industry in particular, since that's what we're talking about. But before we end, is there anything that you want to go over that you want our viewers to know about your department specifically, or HSUS in general?
Anybody who's thinking of getting a dog, we do encourage them to visit humanesociety.org/puppy for information on how to get a puppy from a humane source. But please always consider adoption first, because shelters need you right now more than ever.
Well, thanks, Kathleen. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
Of course, of course. And thanks to all of our listeners here at the AWIP podcast. We appreciate you tuning in, and make sure that you adopt, don't shop, and help us create a more humane world. Thanks for tuning into the AWIP podcast.